Propaganda. America wasn't the only place benefiting from a fresh batch of Christians. In Asia, too, the message of Christianity was spreading. In Vietnam, the Jesuits made thousands of Catholic converts. In China, a Jesuit named Matthew Ricci arrived in Macau in 1582. There he spent 20 years, becoming a Mandarin scholar before he breathed a word about Jesus. This was a man who knew what it was to earn respect, and he knew what it was to value a culture. The version of Catholicism developed in China was rather liberal. Converts were allowed to maintain traditional veneration of their ancestors and of Confucius. The danger was that Jesus became more like a Confucian wise man than the Son of God. Even so, by the time Ricci died, 3,000 people had become Catholics. Meanwhile, in India, a Jesuit called Robert de Nobili, 1577 to 1656, took the unprecedented step of actually dressing like normal people. Although the normal people in this case were those living in southern India. Nobili lived with the people, embraced the culture, and ate the food. He turned vegetarian. He pioneered a kind of Hindu-Christian fusion. Those he converted kept a lot of their Hindu practices, except those involving the worship of idols. When the authorities in Rome heard about his approach, they accused him of watering down the gospel. He argued that it was not his business to turn Indians into little Europeans. He wanted them to become Christians in their own culture. His approach seems very modern, but he went in some ways too far. In deference to the Indian caste system, he fed communion to the untouchables, the Dalits, on the end of a stick. Creating the communion kebab was inventive, but is not perhaps quite what Jesus would have done. Nevertheless, the Catholic Church was embracing mission in a big way. In 1622, the Pope established what was the first ever mission agency, the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. And from the Latin version of its name, we get the English term propaganda. Through the round window. The separatists weren't the only ones having rows in Holland. A Calvinist pastor and academic called Jacob Arminius was given the task of defending predestination against the attacks of a Catholic humanist with the utterly brilliant name of Dirk Coenhert. Arminius is actually Jacob's Latin pen name. His real name was Jacob Hermanzoon. Trouble was, Arminius actually found Coenhert's arguments quite compelling, and he wasn't the only one. He was the third Calvinist pastor who had been given the task, and all three ended up agreeing with Dirk. That, my friends, is the power of the Coenhert, or the Dirkmeister, as I shall now call him, or I would call him if I were actually going to mention him again in this book, which I'm not. Coenhert, there we go, believed that it was possible for a man to live like Christ. Very difficult, admittedly, but possible. Arminius developed a new theory. Although for fear of reprisals, he kept it under his hat for a long time. Not literally, obviously, although he probably did have a very big hat, because a lot of them did in those days. His theory is this. Everyone who became a Christian was automatically saved. But God, being God, could see who would or would not become a Christian with his help. So he chose them and gave them the ability to recognize the truth. For Arminius, God has decided to save believers through grace, that is, through gentle and sweet persuasion, agreeing or congruent with their free choice. When he eventually released his ideas, they caused a storm of controversy, and in the end, the Calvinists held their very own council, a national synod at Dort in 1618. They condemned what they called Arminianism and forbade its preaching. The synod's 93 canons defined proper grown-up Calvinism and formed the basis of the Dutch Reformed Church. Indeed, they defined Calvinism more rigidly than Calvin ever had, and he was so inflexible you could have used him as a tent pole. It was like the Orthodox councils of old. Plus ça change, as Jean Calvin might have said. Calvinism was still officially illegal in the German Empire, although several states were Calvinist. There was a three-way struggle in Central Europe between Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Catholicism. Then in 1617, Archduke Ferdinand, the King of Bohemia, and next in the queue to be Holy Roman Emperor, decided to clamp down on the freedom that Bohemian Protestants enjoyed in the land of Hus. He sent imperial representatives to issue his commands, and the Protestants in Prague chucked them out, literally, through a window. The event, known as the Defenestration of Prague, launched a revolt, then a coup, then an alliance between Bavaria and Spain, then a counterattack, then the 30 Years' War. It all goes to show you should be really careful what you chuck out of a window. The 30 Years' War was a horrible, energy-sapping, attritional, deeply unholy holy war, which drew in Sweden, France, Spain, and Germany. Gradually, the original religious causes of the war were subsumed in a protracted attritional fight for territory, during which Germany was pretty much brought to its knees. Shades of wars to come. More than 10 million people are estimated to have died through the war. By the time the war finished in 1648, no one had really won anything very much. But one thing seems certain to have crystallized in the European mind: religion was not really worth fighting over. The French Eminence Grise, French for greasy eminence, Cardinal Richelieu, said, "The interests of the state and the interests of religion are completely different things." For the best part of 120 years, Europe had been racked by the wars of religion. They were worn out by it. From now on, Europe was set to become gradually, but increasingly, secular. Viva la commonwealth. The same could not be said of Britain. There, politics and religion were so completely intermixed as to be virtually indistinguishable. And in the same year that the 30 Years' War concluded, the Puritans were finally to get their longed-for wish of power, as King Charles I surrendered to parliamentary forces and Oliver Cromwell turned the whole country Puritan and London into Geneva-on-Thames. It began as a religious conflict. James I's son Charles was brought up with the same high regard for the monarchy that his father had had. And when he ascended to the throne in 1625, he started to restore a more traditional ritual to British churches. It was what people were to call Anglo-Catholic. It had vestments and incense and ceremonies. Yet it kept the liturgy and creed intact, but it added a whole lot of what his enemies called popery. His Archbishop, William Laud, maintained that England had never really stopped being Catholic, nor had it really split from Rome. It was not that England was Protestant, it was more that it was a very reformed Catholic. And so the Puritans began to find themselves pushed out. Their preachers were banned. Calvinism was evicted, and Arminian teaching adopted. To a lot of people, though, it was the thin end of the wedge. Charles had married a Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria of France. She had been allowed to keep her own court and her own form of worship in Somerset House, a little piece of Catholic France right in the middle of Protestant London. And they assumed that she was luring the king in the same direction. It had the effect of energizing even the most moderate of the Protestants. They voiced their objections through Parliament, so Charles decided to dissolve Parliament and rule by himself. Problem: he had no money. Without Parliament, he couldn't raise taxes. That was, after all, why kings had parliaments. It wasn't that they wanted to listen to them, it was so that they could get tax laws passed. Still the same today, only replace king with prime minister. Charles tried to raise money himself, using long-forgotten laws and levies, but that just plunged him into new depths of unpopularity. Charles is venerated in some circles today, but honestly, he was one of the most inept kings England has ever had. And his ineptitude reached new heights, or depths, when he took on the Scottish. James I had eventually taken his revenge on all those annoying Puritans in Scotland by reintroducing bishops, bribing the nobility with grants of land to ensure their support. Charles decided to reclaim this land for the church, which made him popular with Scottish bishops and nobody else. Charles then forced a new prayer book on Scotland. On Sunday, the 23rd of July, 1637, the Dean of Edinburgh read it in public for the first time and was promptly hit on the head by a stool. The woman who threw it shouted, "Dare ye say mass in my lug?" Is that ear? Lug? Whatever. The Scottish General Assembly then convened, and not only threw out the prayer book, but all the bishops as well. Charles refused to acknowledge the authority of the Assembly, and the Scots invaded England. But Charles had no money to pay for an army to defend England, because he had abolished Parliament. So he was forced into a humiliating climb down. He recalled Parliament, and they had the king over a barrel. They abolished all the Catholic innovations that Charles had introduced, and the relationship inevitably descended further into conflict. Parliament pressed for deeper and more radical reform. Charles dug his heels in. In 1642, the two sides went to war. The war showed everyone what kind of will the parliamentary forces intended to enforce. They scrapped the prayer book and abolished all bishops. In return for support from the Scottish, they promised to implement the full Presbyterian system. Archbishop Laud was tried and executed on charges of treason, charges that were palpably not true. But, just as in other Protestant takeovers, It was an apparently irresistible move towards radicalism. Cromwell rose to prominence through his policy of rewarding actual ability in his soldiers and commanders. His new model army brought military success after early parliamentary setbacks. And so, in 1648, Charles surrendered. His queen escaped to France, along with their sons. And now the parliamentarians had a bit of a problem. What do you do with an ex-king? Most of them weren't in favour of executing him, but the radical fringes demanded the king's execution and drove out every MP who disagreed. Meanwhile, in defeat, Charles seemed to find a new strength. He refused to admit the authority of the court arranged to try him. And when in the end the radical elements of the parliamentarians took over and the king was sentenced to death, he went with equanimity and courage. He was pretty useless as a king, but in the end he proved himself a courageous man. In many ways, the culmination of Reformation ideas took place on the 30th of January 1649, when the English Puritan Parliament beheaded the king. The effect of this was profound. To many other people, the king was not just another leader, but a divinely appointed individual. To them, the Puritans, in killing the king, had beheaded God.